in today's lecture, I'm going to focus on two different areas. First, I just want to give you an introduction to some of the historical elements of sleeve dance and sword dance, just to give you a taste of some of the research that exists to help us understand the legacy that these dance forms that we'll be learning today actually have developed from. So give you a little taste of the early sources, as well as how dance was incorporated into Xiqu, or Chinese indigenous theater. Then we'll take a look at the 1950s, which was the first moment when the Chinese classical dance forms that we're learning in this residency were actually reconstructed and created as professional programs of training and also choreographic styles. I'll talk just briefly about classical dance in China today. And then the second half of today's talk is meant to help you understand the formal aesthetic components of Chinese classical dance. So when you're watching it, you know what to look for. And also one thing I'll be emphasizing are the ways in which Chinese classical dance actually draw on a number of different formal vocabularies, for example, from painting, from poetry, from music, and from Chinese philosophy. So first, let's talk a little bit about the history of the water sleeve, Weiqiu. This is the Beijing Dance Academy, which is where Professor Shao and Professor Zhang come from. I wanted to let you know that before we launch in. Okay, so archaeologists have found extensive evidence of the water sleeve, or something that appears to be very similar, in archaeological sources as early as the Western Han Dynasty. And one of the most common types of sources actually that have been found are these jade pendants, or jade plaques. They're often found in tombs. And there's been quite a bit of research to find out what the meaning of these plaques are. But one thing that we can tell from looking at them is that they do incorporate the long sleeves. They also incorporate some of the twisting body actions that you'll actually be learning today. These are some other examples of the Han Dynasty archaeological finds, and you can see that there's a similar type of twisting body action. Also, the reverse sleeves can be found in all of these different plaques. And this is a reconstruction of how the plaques were likely used in the tomb. They're actually a type of pendant that some scholars believe had a talismanic function. And so the way that that has been explained is by taking a look at some of the other types of artifacts that we have. So if you take a look at this rubbing from Sichuan, what you can actually see is an event in which you have a musical instrument, the qin, being played, you have people watching, and then you have a dancer performing with the long sleeves. So we get the impression that usually the sleeves went together with the qin. And then here, this is one of the sources that have been used to argue that sleeve dancing was not only a form of entertainment during the Han Dynasty, it was actually a form of connection with the other world. So the sleeve dancer would act as a medium, communicating with spirits outside of the human world, and also possibly helping to take during a funeral, the dancer would actually be responsible for helping to ensure that the deceased soul made it into the realm of immortality. So what you're seeing here are two different images that archaeologists believe actually depict the path of the deceased from the human world to the realm of immortality. And so they go from the bottom of the scroll up to the top of the scroll. And so what you'll see here is, if you look at this part of the scroll here, this is actually an enlarged view. And you can see here there's a person playing a xin, and then there's a person dancing with the sleeves. So if you go back and you look at where that appears in the trajectory, it's actually believed to be a process going from the human world up through this ritual activity in which the dancer would perform, and then you see the deceased meeting with a whole host of servants, and then the very top is the sun and the moon, which represent the land of immortality. And this on the right is actually a Malam Dui unearthed what was draped over the tomb, in the tomb. And so scholars have said that although this does not include a dancer, the image on the right, it includes a similar type of path into immortality that has a similar type of image if you look here, you see the deceased, meaning with the servants, which is also happening up at the top here. And so people have argued that this is actually a passage in which the dancer acts as a guide or a passageway into the other world. And so we also have textual sources that describe this type of ritual performance. So here's an example from the Chu from the 3rd century BCE. And the text reads, "Flourish the drumsticks, beat the drums. The singing begins softly to a slow, solemn measure. Then, as pipes and zithers join in, the sound grows shriller. Now the priestesses come, splendid in their gorgeous apparel, and the hall is filled with a penetrating fragrance. The 5 notes mingle in a rich harmony, and the god is merry and takes his pleasure." So the key term in this passage is actually the priestess. And the Chinese character that's used there is Ling. And Ling has often been argued to be a synonym for this character here, Wu, which is usually translated as a shamaness or a medium. And so in one of the earliest Chinese dictionaries, the Shuowen Jiezi, the explanation for the character priestess is actually said to be a synonym for this character Wu. And the explanation for the character actually links it to the sleeves themselves. So the explanation says that this character symbolizes the appearance of a person dancing with 2 sleeves. And so Susan Erickson, who is one of the archaeologists who's actually studied those jade plaques that I showed earlier in detail, has made this argument. The dancer is an invoker who communicated with the spirits and was a vehicle through which the soul could find safe passage to immortality. So that just gives you a little taste of one way in which many people believe the sleeve served a very important purpose in performance, but also in ritual practice in early China. Here's another example of a poem from the Chu that gives us a sense maybe of what this type of performance experience would have been like. Bells clash in their swaying frames. The catalpa wood zither strings are swept. Their sleeves rise like cross bamboo stems, then slowly shimmer downwards. Pipes and zithers rise in wild harmonies. The sounding drums thunderously roll, and the courts of the palace quake and tremble as they throw themselves into the whirling chu. In wine, they attain the heights of pleasure and give delight to the dear departed. O soul, come back, return to your old abode. And then lastly, we also see descriptions of these performances in poetry from early China. So here's one example from the Eastern Han Dynasty, from the poet Zhang, and it reads, "At first they advanced slowly with figures so thin, they seemed unable to support their gossamer silks. Singing the pure Shao, they suddenly whirled, ever more charming and graceful. They arched their backs. Altogether bodies relaxed, they quickened the tempo, and returned just like a flock of startled cranes. Their vermilion slippers danced between plates and goblets, and they waved their long, dangling sleeves with curvaceous, cultivated bearing. Their lovely dresses fluttered like flowers in the wind. Their eyes cast darting glances. One look could overthrow a city." And so some people have argued that this image of the cranes, the flock of cranes, is actually symbolic of the flight after death. So then, in terms of the sword, I don't want to take too much time to go through these sources because there is, almost for every dynasty, you can find examples like this describing different types of sword and sleeve dances. But just to briefly talk about the sword, again, it's really in the Han Dynasty that we start to see examples of the sword being used not as a weapon, but actually as a form of performance. And so the word that's often used is jian shu, so shu meaning technique or skill. And so the sword actually becomes a prop that's used in performances and also demonstrations of artistic cultivation. And so these are some of the most commonly reconstructed images from, again, Han Dynasty stone reliefs. And here's just one other example where you can see the dancer here with the sword in the hand. And the sword even appears to have what we call the sword cui, this little red dangling fabric that actually do use in the sword dancing today. So the reason that I'm starting off with this is really sort of give a little bit of explanation as to why the sword and the sleeve have such an important role in classical Chinese dance today. And they do remain the two props that are most frequently taught in Chinese professional dance schools, along, of course, with the fan. There's very many different types of fan. There's also a type of handkerchief that's also taught often in folk dance classes. But in terms of Chinese classical dance, the sleeve and the sword are considered to be the two most important props. And part of the reason for that is their long history. Okay, so if we fast forward about a century and a half, during the Ming Dynasty, what we think of today as Chinese indigenous theater, or Xiqu, this is an umbrella category that includes Jingju, Kunju, Yueju, all different types. There's about 300 different types of regional theater forms in China today that all constitute this category we call Xiqu. So around the 16th century, Xiqu emerged as the performance form of the elite. And so it incorporates singing, dancing, acrobatics, or fighting, and also various types of speaking. Yeah, so singing, speaking, fighting, and dancing. Those are the four components. So you can see here, this is an example of a modern rendition of Ba Wang Bie Ji, a very famous story that's often done in many different types of Xiqu forms. And the two swords, Shuangjian, is a scene that's usually included in this performance. And there's also plenty of examples of the sleeve being incorporated into Xiqu performances. So the typical historiography of classical dance in China is that dance forms that were once independent actually got incorporated into this multidimensional theater form around the time of the 16th century, maybe a little bit earlier. Some people argue it happened actually under the influence of the Mongols in the 13th century. And so Joshua Goldstein, who is one of the current experts on Peking opera, actually has argued that the sleeves themselves form a language of expression in Chinese theater that is so significant that it conveys emotion and it can actually convey communication between characters on stage. And so he has written sleeves, and he's talking about in the context of Peking opera. Sleeves can swirl with abandon to express joy. They can serve as handkerchiefs to mop up tears, or droop to the floor like a physical manifestation of an inner despair. Hanging like a curtain beside a woman's cheek. They can convey her flirtatious modesty, or allow her to furtively declare her innermost thoughts in an aside unbeknownst to other characters on stage. And so actually, one of our guest artists, Professor Shao, in addition to teaching dance, has also done extensive fieldwork and research in, for example, Sichuan opera, also Hun opera and Peking opera, in order to learn the sleeve techniques that are used in opera and actually adapt them for the dance classroom. And so what I'm going to talk about now is sort of the modern history of Chinese classical dance. And one of the things that's really interesting about this history is that the dance movements themselves, the techniques of the physical ways of moving the body, became a formal place of experimentation and research, in which the dance technique was not only a way to express ideas or tell stories or convey certain type of characters or even act in a talismanic fashion to transport someone from the human world to the other world. In addition to having those meanings, it also became a purely formal space in which many dancers believed that the way a hand moved, or the way the eyes moved, or the way that a person breathed was in itself a way to convey cultural information, specifically information about what is Chinese culture. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about now, is how Chinese dance actually became a place to research Chinese culture and Chinese philosophy through the acts of physical movement in the human body. And so this was first codified in 1954 at the Beijing Dance School, which is the first professional dance school established in China. And at that time, in addition to having the Russian ballet curriculum that also included European character dance, a new curriculum was developed in order for half of the curriculum to actually be Chinese. So the idea was that professional Chinese dancers, in addition to learning Western ballet or Soviet-style ballet and character dances, that they should also be learning Chinese dance styles. And so to that end, two new curriculum were developed to actually train dancers' bodies to be Chinese. That was the way that this project was articulated by those who created it. And so dancers were being taught to be Chinese in two different ways. One was in the classical sense, and one was in a folk sense. And so I've actually thought a lot about the way that this has been structured. What does it mean to be classical versus folk? Why are these two dimensions both equally important in terms of Chinese identity? But maybe that's something we can talk about in more of the Q&A later on. Today we'll be focusing on the first curriculum, which is Gu Dian Wu, and that's what our guest artists also specialize in. So these are some of the earliest images of the classical dance curriculum. You can see, if you're familiar with Chinese indigenous theater, you can see that the hand actions, the lotus or the orchid flower actually is a movement from Chinese opera, as is the way that the foot is being held in a flexed position. At the same time, you can see that they're using the bar, which is a normal type of training that we find in ballet. So classical dance was a fusion of elements of training taken from ballet, along with Chinese components of physical form and physical movement. So martial arts were contributing to this movement repertoire. This is also a movement from Chinese Qiqu, indigenous theater. Here you can see also theater movements being incorporated into the classroom. And of course the sword was there as well. So the goal of creating this Chinese classical dance curriculum really had a couple different purposes. First of all, it was created to serve as an indigenous movement technique to train dancers. But it was also meant to be a new vocabulary for creating dance works. So in a way you can see it as a parallel, for example, to Mingyue or Chinese folk music. The idea was that the instruments themselves, using an erhu was different from using a violin, or using a pipa was different from using a Western instrument. And so in a way, they wanted to create Chinese instruments, which meant training Chinese bodies to be like Chinese instruments that could then perform in a Chinese way. And there's a similar type of parallel also to painting. At this time, the idea of guohua, or national painting, was a new area of exploration in China. And so many people argued that as long as you used a brush and ink, no matter what you drew, it was Chinese in nature. So it was a similar type of correlation in this sense. The brush and the ink would be similar to this Chinese trained body, as they saw. The body, again, became the tool, and the movement form became the technique or the aesthetic style that was being used. And so in this sense, dance actually became a site for research into Chinese culture. What type of movement would convey something Chinese, like an ink painting, or like a pipa, or like a qin sound. And so the idea of a Chinese movement aesthetic emerged as an object of study. Many people were involved in trying to learn about Chinese dance history so that they could create this new form. And they also saw it as a goal, trying to create artworks that would then somehow convey a feeling of Chineseness. And so this was codified several times. Here's one example of a training technique book that we still have from 1960, in which you can actually see, you flip through the pages and you can get a sense of what movements were considered, what hand actions were actually considered to be important for this training curriculum. And so these are some of the examples of the dance works that were created early on to try to develop this aesthetic in the creative realm. So you can see many of these are based on Chinese folk legends. And you can see again the sword and the sleeve both form important elements in this choreographic style. So the style is new, but it's drawing on many different types of source material to create this new form. So that was the 1950s. As we know, during the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to about the mid-70s, there was a focus away from this type of creation here, and a focus more on what was at the time considered to be more modern or more revolutionary or less feudal in the language of the time. And so that's when we got the revolutionary ballets that you may all have seen, in which dancers were really dancing on point, using more of a ballet aesthetic, although it was still combined with some Chinese elements. But after the Cultural Revolution ended, there was actually a return of interest in these indigenous movement styles. And so that happened not only on the stage, but also in the classroom. And so the style that Professor Zhang and Professor Shao actually trained in was created when they were undergraduate students. They both entered the Beijing Dance Academy in the early 80s, which is when this new style of Chinese classical dance known as Shenyun was being developed. And so they were among the first students to learn that curriculum, and of course now they teach that curriculum in Beijing today. So the Shenyun curriculum is interesting because in an institutional sense, it was meant to take Chinese dance training, which previously had only been for middle school students and high school students, and to actually make it into a college curriculum, because the Beijing Dance Academy now had a college associated with it. And so the idea was, how can we take this research that we've done into movement styles and actually make it more theoretical, more culturally sophisticated, and also make it more useful for training students to an even higher level. And so the idea that was created was this idea of shen, meaning body, and yun, meaning rhyme. And so yun is actually one of the key aesthetic principles of Chinese classical dance that I'll be talking about in just a minute. But so this was meant to actually reintroduce and strengthen the so-called Chinese feeling of these dance forms, also to make it appropriate for a university audience. And this is when the barehanded shenyun, which is shenyun actions that don't have a sword or a sleeve, were introduced, and then water sleeve and sword were actually introduced as part of this required university curriculum. And so here you can see an example from one of the sword dance classes about 5 years ago. And so these are just examples of what this curriculum looks like without any props. So I'm going to show you a really brief video of each of these two styles so that you can have an image in your mind before I start to explain the aesthetic features. So here's a little clip from a graduation demonstration at the Beijing Dance Academy. Of the sword action.
走，一、二，好，延伸，对，起，好的，口人吸，走，气手。
So this is what you'll have a chance to learn in just a few minutes. But before you actually start to feel the movements in your own body, I want to give you some of the vocabulary that the art critics in China use to talk about these dance styles. What should you be looking for? So if you think about different dance forms that you might be familiar with, for example, ballet, one of the things that we always try to achieve in ballet movement is a sense of upwardness and lightness, a sense of delicacy. And also, of course, if you're using your leg, it needs to be straight. So these are some of the aesthetic features that we would expect to find in ballet. In a dance form such as tap, what you're really focusing on is the rhythm. And of course, there are lots of different examples. In ballroom dance, for example, what you're looking for is a sense of mutual interaction between two partners, a sense of really precision and speed and musical accuracy. So each different dance form has its own features that are considered to be aesthetically important. And of course, Chinese dance has its own set of features that are considered to be necessary to make the dance beautiful, to make the dance technically sophisticated. And then in this case, what I find particularly interesting is that these are the features that dance artists in China argue make this technique actually more Chinese. So it's not only an aesthetic that makes it beautiful, it's an aesthetic that, according to those who create the form, would argue that give it cultural authenticity. And so the first concept here that's often used is the idea of qi, or breath. And we know that this is used in Chinese philosophy, it's also used in Chinese martial arts, and also Chinese medicine. So it's a very interdisciplinary concept in Chinese aesthetic and other types of realms. The second term that's often used is yun, or rhyme. And I'll talk about these two terms more in just a minute. The next important term that's often used is the image, or xiang. There's a word called yi xiang, meaning image, that's often used to describe a piece of poetry that creates an image in your mind that lasts with you. And so when we talk about dance pieces having an 意象, it means that it leaves a very clear image in your mind. The next element that we look for is roundness. So if you're moving from one place to the next, instead of going in a straight line, you go in a curved line. So I'll show you some examples, but the idea is that the more round an action is, and so it can be in your hand, it can be in your foot, it can be in your body, and it can be in your arms. So the more circles you can identify, the more circles you can create, and they can be tiny circles, or they can be these kind of circles. The more circles you can create, the better the dance is. And then, of course, we have something called 尽力, 尽, which is kind of difficult, but also kind of easy to understand. It's the basic idea of a force. Some kind of action. So you'll see when you learn the sleeve and the sword, this is very important because to get the sleeve to move, you have to use the 尽. You have to use a little bit of force in the right way so that the sleeve will continue that action. So that's more of a physical property. And then lastly, there's this really interesting philosophical concept called 是, which a French philosopher, François Julien, actually wrote an entire 250-page book just about this idea because he thinks it's so important, so central to Chinese philosophy. And I'll explain that more in just a second too. So some people translate it as propensity. It can also be translated as a configuration of things in space that then lead to a certain type of movement. So vital breath, this is from that book that I just mentioned. Julien says, it's the single breath at the origin of things. Forever circulating, this vital breath is an inherent animating energy that never ceases circulating and concentrating itself as at the origin of all reality. And by circulating, it bestows consistency on reality. So the simplest way to think of qi, of course, is just breath. But the idea is that this breath is not just flowing through the human body, it's actually flowing through all things in the universe. And so that's why it's more than just a physical action. It actually has this aesthetic and even philosophical and even scientific element to it. And so usually qi and yun are used together in dance. And so Edward Ho has actually argued that this is not only central to dance, but is also central to music in China. And so Edward Ho writes, the most important consideration in the technique of, he's talking about musical performance, is not the question of dexterity or any other technical aspect, but actually the question of how qi is manipulated. Qi is the creative force that begins, sustains, and completes a work of art, without which there is no life. It forms the root for yun, which is the facilitous expression of qi. So if you think of yun being the correct use of breath, yun, like qi, means different things in different situations. In phonetic studies, it means tone. In poetry, it means rhyme. In painting, it means rhythm. In music, it can mean resonance, a residual feeling, melodic motion, or musical expression. So I like to think of yun as the vibration that is left with you after you hear a piece of music, or you see a piece of painting, or you watch a piece of dancing. So the word yun actually does have a long history in Chinese literary writing. And so here's just one example from a poet. And the poem has been translated in this way. That which has yun lives. That which lacks yun dies. That which has yun is elegant. That which lacks yun is vulgar. That which has yun resounds. That which lacks yun sinks. That which has yun is far-reaching. That which lacks yun is limited. So you get a sense, it gives things life, gives things elegance, it makes them resound, and it makes them have a far-reaching impact. And I thought it would be a little bit interesting for you to hear the colloquial ways that I heard yun used in the classroom when I was studying dance in China. So these are some of the examples. Oftentimes yun would be compared to a flavor. So instead of using a musical metaphor, the resonance of a movement, people would talk about the scent that a movement gave them, or the flavor that they could get from the movement itself. And so they would compare it to food, they would compare it to tea. So a dance movement that really didn't have that quality would be compared to plain water, whereas a dance movement that had the quality would be compared to tea. So if it had yun, it would have flavor like tea. And then of course it was compared to beauty and compared to Chineseness. And so if we look back, so I just gave you a little bit of more in-depth understanding of qi and yun. Xiang, I'll talk about in the context of a couple of works in just a minute, and also roundness and jin. But I want to talk for just one more minute about this idea of shi, or propensity. So a common expression by Chinese dancers today is 有姿,有势. So the zi here refers to a static position, what we might call a line in ballet. The shi actually refers to that sense of movement that's contained in the action itself. So you can see in this image, there's the shi is actually an action that we can see about to happen moving in this direction. In this image here, the shi might be a spiraling action that's about to happen, or was just continued through this movement. So it means that a static position, in addition to being static, also has movement. And so this Julian, when he talks about shi in the context of Chinese art, he argues that in China, artistic activity is actually understood as a process of actualization. So there's actually this configuration of things in the world that already exist. And the role of the artist is to correctly make use of that positioning to create something beautiful. So in the context of props, this is actually very important, because one of the things that you'll learn in the workshop in just a minute is that a sword has its own weight. If you allow the weight of the sword to actually move you, then it will be a correct movement. And the same with the sleeve. If you allow the sleeve to actually continue its own action, allowing it to move is actually part of the dance itself. And so that's actualizing this potential that already exists in the environment, according to this idea. Or the idea of dynamism that's already inherent in that thing itself, that you're then moving with when you dance with it. And so this is actually a quote from Professor Zhang's technique book about jian. And he says that the ultimate achievement in sword dance is actually jian ren he yi, so sword and person become one. And so this is how he describes it. In the gradual development of each transformation, the increase in density, strength, scale, and speed from one movement to the next, and the increasing difficulty of every kind of sword method, and flashing turns and leap of bodily technique form into a kind of expressive language, making the body and the sword, the form and the spirit mutually responsive, mutually effective. This is from whence comes the perfect accord between the character of sword dance movement and the character of the human persona in the compression of the soul of the performer. So this idea, again, that the human is actually part of an environment, and it's the interaction of those two things that make the dance beautiful. And so if we think about props, I think there's actually 3 levels on which we should think about them. The first one is symbolic. So I'll show you an example in just a minute. This work here is an example of a symbolic prop. In this piece of dance work, it's a solo. The prop that's being used here is actually an enlarged brush. And so in a sense, this prop is telling us that this character is a scholar, a wenren, a person who knows how to write, a person who knows how to paint, a person who knows how to do calligraphy. And so in that sense, if we just take the brush alone as a symbol, it actually has a lot of meaning, because it references this entire history of the idea of a literary person in China. Second, the prop actually has a kinesthetic dimension, and that is acting as an extension of the technique that's being used in the body. So for example, I can create a circle with my body, but if I have an extension, like a sword or a sleeve, that actually makes that movement bigger. And so it's just simply an extension of the physical movements of the human body. And some would argue, so this is something that Professor Shao actually emphasizes a lot, it's not only an extension of the physical movements, but it can actually be an extension of emotional dimensions. And so she's drawing oftentimes on qiqu performance, Chinese opera performance, what Joshua Goldstein was talking about earlier, that with the sleeve, you can convey an emotion. And so that's sort of an extension of this maybe kinesthetic, but also emotional type of expression. In Chinese, it might be called a Weiqiu or Weizai, something that takes the body and makes it larger than life. But then there's this final dimension, which is that through this process of learning to work with an object, so learning how to take advantage of the shi, the propensity of the object, it's actually very difficult, because oftentimes what we want to do is we want to just move it from here to here. We want to be the ones being the agent in that activity. And so learning to dance with props can actually also be a type of cultivation in which you have to learn to allow the object to move on its own. And so many people have drawn connections between that and Taoist philosophy. This idea that you're acting, but you're also not acting. So wu wei is one way that people explain this. And so by learning to dance with a prop, you're actually also cultivating a sense of harmony between yourself and the environment. And so let's take a look at these two contemporary Chinese classical dance works, both of which are highly representative today of the style of dancing that we will be learning. And the reason I chose these two is that neither of them use a sword or a sleeve, but you can see the similar types of aesthetic features being used in these two works. So the first one I'll show you is called Shu Yun. So Shu means book or calligraphy. Yun is the word that I just told you a minute ago that means rhyme or resonance. So the resonance of calligraphy, that's the title of the piece. So you can try to look for all those different dimensions that I just talked about in this piece. Piece in this style. And here's one other example. This is called shan wu. So shan is fan, wu is dance. Dancing is a very difficult word to translate. It's usually used to mean ink painting. So the idea of this dance piece is using the fan to dance and create a very abstract sense of an ink painting. So in this piece, you can actually really see how she uses the fan through its own weight to allow it to create a trajectory through space. Like right there, she lets the fan pull her down. Very obvious circling action. And that was an example of jin, that really tiny force that actually causes a whole thread of movement. end by showing you an example of how a Chinese dance critic responded to that last piece that I just showed you in a way that really does explicitly connect the aesthetic of the dance to philosophical ideas. And so he writes, 上舞丹心 is precious in that it offers the audience a form beyond form, 向外之相, so the image beyond the image, tableau, allowing people through it to experience without limit, end beyond rhyme, or 韵外之志. So he uses the xiang, or the image, and the yun, or the rhyme, in his explanation. And he's also quoting these Taoist philosophical elements. And so that to really understand Chinese classical dance, you almost have to understand all these different types of poetry, painting, philosophy, just even to make sense of how people are talking about the works themselves. So with that, thank you everyone for listening to the talk. And we will bring our guest artists to actually do a brief demonstration of their dances, and then we'll actually split off. And so for those of you who are interested in learning in the water sleeve, trying out the water sleeve, you can actually stay in this room. We're going to move the chairs from side to side. And then those of you who are interested in learning sword will actually move off into the back room after the two performances. And of course, not everybody will be able to participate, so it's also fine if you just want to watch, in which case you can go back and forth from room to room and watch what's going on. So let's actually start. Yeah, you can.